Recording.
Recording in progress.
Welcome everyone to a new edition of the Seleukid lecture series. I'm Altai Joshkun from the University of Waterloo, and I'm co-hosting this series together with Rabbi Dr. Ben Skolnick from the Southern Connecticut State University. And we have an exciting lecture today by our friend Dr. Eran Almagor from Jerusalem, The Elephant in the Room, the Battle of Ipsus Revisited. Ben is very soon going to present our guest and introduce our guest a little bit further. After Eran will have delivered his speech, I'll briefly introduce our respondent, Angus Jacobson from the University of Tasmania, and a very special thanks to him already now because it's around 2 o'clock in the night for him. So with that, I pass it on to Ben.
Okay, thank you all for being with us. The Seleukid lecture series has been going on for several years now, and it's been a delight, and we've been honored with a lot of wonderful lectures, and today will be no exception. Eran Almagor is a scholar who specializes in ancient history, especially in the interactions between the Greek world and the Persian. He is a leading expert on Plutarch, especially analyzing his take on Persian royalty and history. And Eran has been a real friend to this series and to all our Seleukid efforts. He's, I don't know, is this the second? I think it's the third time maybe that he's lectured for this series. He also lectured recently in Utrecht at our Seleukid study days with a remarkable lecture about the Seleucids in the reception in modern Jewish and modern national Jewish and Israeli culture. One of the things that Eran has lectured us about in the past is the Greek book of Esther, with remarkable contributions to that. Eran has been a very good friend and a wonderful participant, and we welcome him today. Eran, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. I'd like to share a PowerPoint. Hang on. Can you see it?
If you could do full, that's good. Great.
Yeah, great. Okay, great. Thank you. So thank you very much for the presentation, for the invitation. There's a disturbing discrepancy between the grave importance of some of the military engagement or the battles we know of in the Hellenistic period for the history of the region or for the history of humanity on the one hand, and the meager, almost non-existent information we possess of them on the other. This discrepancy partially stems from an intentional effort to suppress the memory of the Hellenistic period altogether in later time by the imperial Greeks and finally in the Byzantine curriculum. One of the most important battles or military engagement of the period was the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BC, in which Antigonus and his son Demetrius lost to the coalition of allies formed against them. There are not too many sources on this military engagement, and as I will argue in this paper, even they are problematic to the extent that we need to revise and reject what they say. But first of all, when we are dealing with revision of historical tradition or questioning the tradition, or indeed when we are dealing with the accounts of war elephants, we must mention Altai's groundbreaking paper. In short, this paper shows that the presentation in the alleged elephant victory in 275 BC, where supposedly 16 elephants were used in Antiochus I's army against the Galatians, coming from Lucian, Seleucus, is entirely wrong and should not be relied upon. These myths of the Seleukid army and the imaginative use of the elephants correspond with the Seleukid self-image and ideology. Altai's paper has influenced me, and the following paper, a version of which I already delivered, is a homage and tribute to Altai, a version of which, to Altai, I follow his skepticism and his methodology of inspecting the nature of ancient texts. I would also like to mention the most recent paper I'm aware of contradicting this sort of skepticism, which actually designates the name Elephant Skepticism by Troutman. This is another of his attacks on this sort of skepticism. He traces this sort of skepticism to the Roman attitude, not just mentioning. Now, our most important source, it contains a very short description. That's Plutarch's Life of Demetrius, chapters 28 to 29. What Plutarch tells us, we have to supplement by other bits and pieces from other texts. These are the passages in Diodorus's books 20 and 21, a mention in Appian, the name of the battle site, and other scattered details. In what follows, I will present some arguments aimed to reconstruct the battle as far as we can. I hope that if you do not completely agree with the argument itself and my reconstruction, at least you could appreciate the problems and the method involved in rereading our sources. I take it that the background to the battle itself is well known. It was the culmination of an effort by 4 allies, Ptolemy, Lysimachus, Cassander, and Seleucus, to block the aspirations of Antigonus to rule a vast empire. As far as his projected plan to maintain Alexander's dominion unified. This is why it has been sometimes also been called in research the Battle of the Five Kings, although Ptolemy and Cassander were not present in the former, barely helpful. And I apologize for the map, but that's the best I could come up with, which shows the entire. The description in Plutarch is too short and abbreviated. Important details are missing, and some details which are present are completely unacceptable. And this is what Plutarch says about the battle itself. The translations, I mostly use the translations of the Loeb series, both for Plutarch and Diodorus. He, Antigonus, took the field with more than 70,000 infantry, 10,000 horse, 75 elephants, while his adversaries had 64,000 infantry, 500 more horse than he, 400 elephants, and 120 chariots. And then again in the next chapter, I will read it very quickly. After the armies had engaged, Demetrius, with the largest and best part of the cavalry, clashed with Antiochus, the son of Seleucus. He fought brilliantly and routed his enemy, but by pursuing him too fiercely and eagerly, he threw away the victory. For he himself was not able to turn back and rejoin his infantry, since the enemy's elephants were thrown in his way. And Seleucus, observing that his opponent's phalanx was unprotected by cavalry, took measures accordingly. He did not actually charge upon them, but kept them in fear of a charge by continually riding around them, thus giving them an opportunity to come over to his side. And this was actually came to pass. For a large body of them, detached from the rest, came over to him of their own accord, and the rest were routed. To the last, he, Antigonus, that's the last sentence, kept watching eagerly for his son. Then a whole cloud of javelin were let fly at him, and he fell. So that's Plutarch. As said, this description can be augmented by 2 passages of Diodorus, one extant and 2 preserved by his Byzantine excerptors. At the end of Book 20, Diodorus describes the build-up to the battle. When Seleucus reached Cappadocia in the winter of 302 BC, at this time, Seleucus also arrived, having crossed over from the upper satrapies into Cappadocia with a large army, and after making huts for the soldiers, he went into winter quarters nearby. He had foot soldiers to the number of about 20,000, about 12,000 horsemen, including his mounted archers, 480 elephants, and more than 100 scythe chariots. And there are 2 fragments. These are the 2 fragments. In the battle, the elephants of Antigonus and Lysimachus fought as if nature had matched them equally in courage and strength. And the second, Antigonus, was pierced by many missiles, and his body was carried from the field and was buried with royal honors. based on these accounts, historians have deduced the relative position and strength of the two sides. I would like to express my hesitation, indeed to follow the skepticism of previous generations, as to the depiction of the elephants. The most startling element is the number of elephants. This appears to be an inflated and exaggerated number. It is the largest number of all war elephants we know of in the Hellenistic armies and for any given battle. In this I follow Tarn, who famously expressed this sentiment. The number is too remote from anything else known. The largest force of elephants which Greeks ever saw in action was the 200 of Porus. The largest force which any Greek ever commanded was the 120 or thereabouts which Eudamus gave to Eumenes. The largest force which any king is recorded on good authority to have possessed is the 150 of Antiochus III. By a good authority, Tarn means Polybius. We can argue with that, but the doubt remains basically about the 400 elephants. That number, 400, stands out among the other figures which appear reasonable and realistic, more or less. According to Diodorus, to the coalition, Seleucus brought with him 20,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, most of them light horses and javeliniers, elephants and chariots. Lysimachus eventually brought 5,000 men. The troops of Cassander and Lysimachus were together 44,000 strong. Even after accepting an emendation of the text, as Bar Kokhba proposed, that is, that the allied cavalry was 5,000 stronger than that of Antigonus and not 500, as the text of Plutarch has it, a variant stemming from a copying error, surely. Even then, the number of elephants stands out. Now, not a few historians accept the number 400 as true and realistic. For instance, Billows, and recently the book by Whitley and Dunn. So Seleucus and Lysimachus had at least 400 elephants at their disposal, which proved to be a decisive advantage. Consequently, almost all reconstructions of the battle are in fact a rephrasing of Plutarch's picture. Other scholars, however, are aware of some problems and have tried to minimize them slightly. For instance, Bar Kokhba suggests the number 300, leaving about 300 elephants for the decisive maneuver. It is important to note that Diodorus has 480, which is not quite the same as 400. And this in itself might indicate that something has gone wrong with the transmission or interpretation of the number. I will address this shortly. One of the justifications given to the disproportionate number, 400 elephants, is the famous pact of Seleucus with the Mauryan king Chandragupta in early 304 or 302. By which ended the war between them. In this pact of friendship and alliance, Seleucus received 500 of these animals in exchange for renouncing sovereignty over territories in the Indus Valley, west of the Indus. That figure was known in antiquity as evidenced by several texts, among them Strabo and Plutarch himself in the life of Alexander. The fact that the number has often been repeated, of course, does not make it true. It is also suspect and was questionable by historians as well, again by Tarn. One clue as to the number being typologically mythical is the gift of elephant, of the same number of elephant, given by a mythic king to Hercules, as described by Megasthenes. Now, Megasthenes was Seleucus's ambassador at the court of Chandragupta and may have been the ultimate source of the number of elephants and other details involved in the celebrated pact. Tarn believes that Megasthenes obtained this information through informants who replaced a repeated stereotyped figure found in Indian literature to express huge numbers of large quantity of things. Now, we should note that Tarn originally accepted the 480 elephants at Ipsus the Cambridge Ancient History, but after less than a decade changed his mind after a detailed examination of the evidence for the generic use of 500. It is important to be cautious when it comes to numbers, especially when some of them may appear unrealistic. Other numbers associated with Chandragupta's army are exaggerated, as noted by scholars as well. There is another description that Seleucus had in fact a herd of 500 elephants in Upper Mea, that I mentioned Strabo. And here I shall quote him. Here too, that's Strabo's book 16. Here too, Seleucus Nicator kept the 500 elephants and the greater part of the army, as did also the later kings. All this makes the number extremely doubtful, especially the ending of the Strabonian passage, as did also the later kings, since for the later Seleucids we have different, more modest numbers. Yet even if we assume that Seleucus was given 500 elephants, as we can still doubt that nearly all of these elephants were employed at Ipsus. The argument against one figure does not necessarily entail an argument against the other. And here I part ways from Tarn and what he would have us believe. These are two different arguments. And concerning Plutarch's figure in the biography of Alexander, chapter 62, let us examine the context. The narrator is aware that the number of Porus's elephants might appear exaggerated. As he claims, there was no boasting in these reports. And as proof of this, he claims that later on, Androkotos, that's Chandragupta, gave 500 elephants to Seleucus. Now the chapter continues. The rest of the chapter concerns Alexander's own efforts to make his own image appear bigger. I skip over that. Resorting to many deceitful and fallacious devices for the enhancement of his fame. For instance, he had armor prepared that was larger than usual, and mangers for horses that were higher, and bits that were heavier, etc. So we're dealing here with images, and inflated images or exaggerated images that Alexander himself used to enhance his own image. At the same chapter that Plutarch brings the number of 500 elephants given to Seleucus. So all these details, when taken together, grouped together, may indicate that we have here a tongue-in-cheek account on Plutarch's part. He did not believe these numbers. And specifically, he did not believe the number of 500 elephants. But more on this later. The number of elephants employed in Ipsus was as 400 is problematic and almost unbelievable for several reasons. The first has to do with logistics. Now, Seleucus had to move 400 or 500 elephants from India for Babylon or the satrapies to Asia Minor in a relatively short time. He had to hurry to the battlefield in order not to let Lysimachus be overcome by Antigonus. That's the description given by Diodorus. And as you can see, the entire passage in Diodorus betrays a sense of urgency. He saw that the winter season was at hand. He learned that Seleucus was coming down with a great force. So not to be forced to decide the war before the army in Europe came to join him. All this spells an urgency, but it is almost impossible because it is more likely that the dates spread out to a year more or less. The Battle of Ipsus is usually thought as taking place in the summer of 301. A march from Babylon of the sort that Diodorus describes should be taken as a rapid one, but the march of an army with 500 elephants would necessarily slow Seleucus down. These elephants were to be transmitted through different climates and various road conditions. And here I could not resist a description of the handling of an elephant. I will mention it briefly. Here you also see, and the map of billows, also the sense of urgency of the march. But this is the passage I meant. I skip over to the last sentence on the elephant. He eats too much and is costly to maintain. He's very delicate and highly susceptible to climatic changes, cannot stand cold, and altogether requires a lot of mollycoddling. And another study on the logistics, in this case of Alexander the Great, and by Donald Angus. And Donald Angus calculated generally the rate of the march of Alexander. He made the following assessment: that no elephant, living or dead, could possibly achieve a rate of 40 miles per day or even 10 miles per day. The maximum recorded rate for the entire army is 9.5 miles per day, and it is doubtful whether this rate could ever be surpassed by any conditions. The army's average rate of speed over long distances was 13 miles per day. So, but the distance from the battle site to Babylon is roughly 2,000 kilometers. The march would thus not match a description of a rapid one as in Diodorus, but one which would continue for more than 4 months, even half a year. So it is surprising to read in Bar Kokhba, who accepts the figures of Diodorus and Plutarch, that the terrain was difficult for only 20 elephants. It seems likely that 20 elephants had to be abandoned on the way to Cappadocia because of the difficult route and the speed of the march, and 80 more were unfit to the battle in the summer, either because of the exhausting effects of the march or because of the severe Cappadocian winter. One can assume that if conditions along the way in Cappadocia were that bad, as they probably were, many more than 100 elephants would have been unfit for battle, but let us assume that indeed only 100 elephants were disbanded. Now, note how, by the way, how modern scholars try to accommodate Plutarch and Diodorus in ingenious ways. The second and more crucial reason to doubt this number in Ipsus involves the positioning of the elephants in the battle. As we saw in Plutarch, during the battle, the elephants were allegedly maneuvered to block Demetrius from returning to the scene. Where were they positioned prior to the maneuver? According to one approach, that's by Tarn, that before he changed his mind you, the elephants were at the reserve behind the phalanx, so that Seleucus's intention would not be disclosed and Demetrius would not fall for the obvious ruse. As you can see, it is also repeated in several recent reconstructions. And scholared for reasons of practicality. Some elephants might be kept in reserve if they were too numerous to deploy in a single line, as Seleucus will have done at Ipsus if he had 400. The interception of Demetrius's cavalry may well have been carried out by some of Seleucus's elephant that had been kept behind his line. This suggestion also appears in the volume by Whitley and Dunn. Here. But this is impossible, not only because of the danger in positioning so many elephants behind the phalanx line, but also because it is not feasible to hide 400 elephants from the other party, not even a lower number, incidentally. The assertion of Bar Kokhba against Tarn is conclusive. I very much doubt if the allies maintained a reserve force of elephants behind the center under Seleucus's command. A second defense line might have betrayed their tactical plan of drawing Demetrius to the battlefield. To keep the elephants in reserve would have given away their plan. So Bar Kokhba, who believes Plutarch's text and the maneuver, reaches this conclusion because he believes in the maneuver. So they couldn't possibly be kept at the reserve. Now, Scholard writes in general. Just a second. Yes, okay, I'm sorry. According to another approach, the elephants were positioned at the front of the line, at the vanguard, before the phalanx. And that's also impossible. Now, Scholard writes in general. The normal position was a single line of elephants in front of either part of the whole part of the main battle line, and not too near the front line, in order that they might have some room to retreat if necessary, and to give the infantry time to open up the line to let them through. Now, in this, it is crucial to keep in mind the intervals between the elephants. For instance, the Battle of Gabiene, Scarlett writes that Antigonus had 65 elephants, which he distributed in front of his whole line. But since his main punch was to be in the right wing, he may have placed some 30 of them there. The intervals between them were filled as usual with light troops. And again, in the Battle of Gaza, between the intervals of the 30 elephants, he placed light armed troops, etc. And the intervals could be even larger. At the Battle of the Hydaspes, Porus placed the elephants in the front, each animal being not less than a platform, that's 30 meters apart, so that they might be extended in the front before the whole of the flanks. Now, I have been struggling with the question of the length of the line if all 400 elephants were to be positioned in front. A few months ago, I discussed this with our respondent, Angus, and he will come up with an answer shortly. So not to give away his answer, I would have to say that the line would have to be spread out and reach an immense length. But in the illustration, you can see that the huge number of beasts will stretch further than the extent of the average line. But this does not have to be that way. For instance, the line in the Battle of Raphia stretched to about 3 or 4 kilometers. So if we follow the sources carefully. But then again, there are other considerations here, like the nature of the terrain, which has to be flat for an immeasurable distance, and the size of the army. So alternatively, 400 elephants would have been significantly drawn in depth if ordered in lines. But this could not be if the cavalry is to be used in substantial manner in the battle. And the Battle of Ipsus had thrice as many horses and cavalry than the Battle of Raphia, if we trust our sources. So it is not reasonable that the elephants were drawn in significant depth before the horses. And luckily, this is the point I think most commentators agree upon, and certainly the respondent and myself, that this is simply not possible that the elephants were kept in front of the line, if we believe the description and the maneuver used. And which leads us to the next point, the question of the maneuver itself. Such a maneuver is unknown in sources either before or after the battle. It is unique to this battle alone. This already raises suspicion. For if it were that successful, why was it not repeated later on? Admittedly, this is an argument out of silence. But I am not sure that elephants were employed at all on this large scale in future battles. The argument out of silence can work both ways. For instance, Scarlett claims very many wars were fought in which elephants must have been used, although their participation is not recorded. The elephants, apart from their role in overawing the mercenaries, must have figured these in these and other engagement, as for example when Seleucus overran Asia Minor and defeated Lysimachus at Coropedium in the last great battle, but their achievements there remain unsung. So this is again a question of probability and reasonableness. It is more reasonable to think that the elephants were subsequently used. Is it more reasonable to think that the elephants were subsequently used in large numbers and in that maneuver, and that all of our sources are silent about it, or that it never happened? The maneuver basically involved the transition of elephants either from the reserve or from the front, as I said. Both of the possibilities are not very likely. The elephants who already began marching and were made to move sideways and backwards against the previous position of the Allied left wing. This sounds like a very dangerous exercise. especially as in the illustration given here. If they were positioned at the front, to go backward and sideways is practically impossible. The risk of losing control over elephants in the midst of fight was real and tangible. There are several examples of things going terribly wrong with elephants during battles, so I give a few examples in no particular order. In the Battle of Raphia, famously, Ptolemy's elephants were thrown into confusion and driven back on their own lines, and already thrown the confusion on the same side, on their own men. In the Battle of Gaza, again, Demetrius' elephants fell into disarray when they were shot at light troops and halted by iron spikes, causing Demetrius' cavalry to panic and flee. In the Battle of Gabiene, here the elephants, Eumenes effectively lost control of his elephants when they began charging against the enemy at the start, creating a cloud of dust, which was used by Antigonus to capture the baggage of the enemy. Another example is the siege of Megalopolis, described by Diodorus. Here again, in the famous description at the end, I will skip over this. It brought death to many on their own side by the elephants. And even in Africa, Livy uses the term genus anceps. The translation is, these animals cannot be depended upon, but it's basically a species which is double-edged or double-sided. The elephants galloped back into the Carthaginian ranks, where they caused much more destruction than they caused amongst the enemy, and so forth. So indeed, as the famous description has it here by Benedict, the instability or flightiness of elephants is the characteristic that made them so unreliable and dangerous to their own troops during their early use in warfare. Historians cite frequently that the elephants, by stampeding, did more damage to the men of their own army than they did of the enemy. It's a little bit exaggerated, but that's the description. And another description by Armandi in his famous Histoire militaire des éléphants, about that elephants, commanders are giving two roles to chance when using elephants. And when we speak about chance, here again is scholar, liable at all times to be panicked, perhaps by a sudden noise or movement, they naturally became especially unruly when wounded or when their mahouts were killed. We do not know to what extent mahouts were regularly equipped with the means to put them out of action. No doubt most commanders who used elephants would say first time lucky, but after that a gamble. Now, Troutman is but before that, a very famous source, Curtius Rufus, gives a speech to Alexander that he despised using these animals because they make more damage on their own side than on the enemy. And to which Scholard replied very succinctly in his argument, this is nonsense. But he gave no argument for this. Curtius Rufus, again, at the Battle of Hydaspes, gives another speech to Alexander to that effect. And even Scholard himself, when he describes the Battle of Hydaspes, writes that the elephants did do damage to their own troops. So the nonsense part, notwithstanding, even Scholard follows his sources and describes the behavior of elephants as doing damage to their own troops. Now, Troutman is of the opinion that all this was a Roman trope. Sorry, I don't know. This was a Roman trope to denigrate elephants and war elephants. But while this is true, that these descriptions and rhetorical expression are exaggerated, but one cannot deny that the use of elephant during battles was particularly risky. The fear of its employment cannot be simply brushed away. Putting into effect this kind of movement involving 400 elephants again, moving sideways and even backwards, would statistically increase the chance of things going terribly wrong. No sane commander would take that risk. Now, the topography is also to be considered. The battlefield, although not mentioned by name by the two accounts, Plutarch and Diodorus, is mentioned in other places as Ipsus. Plutarch himself mentioned it in the life of Pyrrhus. And he is to be identified perhaps with a village along one village, or and indeed there's another suggestion that it is the village Sipsin in Phrygia. The latter option gained more weight, as one of the scholars says, Balance, that the name Sipsin is virtually meaningless in Turkish and could easily have been derived from the Byzantine original Sipsin, as the Omicron transformed into E, so Sipsin. Since Ipsus was, as the former courses of the river, near the juncture of the two rivers, Akar Chai and its tributary, both not very deep, the former more a stream, and since there are wide valleys of 1 or 2 kilometers in width and low hills, one should seriously question the purpose of the maneuver. Since Demetrius could easily cross the river and arrive at the other side back in the battle scene. It does not matter how many elephants were posted on the entrance to one valley. As Bar Kokhba himself admits, it would have been easy to circumvent by side routes leading into the plain of Ipsus, especially to the east. And he refers to the current course of the river and not the ancient course of the river. And again, the above-mentioned topographical difficulties are effectively blocking Demetrius' route back. So if the number is not correct, how many elephants were there? And what really happened during the fight? It would appear that the figure was much lower. Still high, but within likelihood. Tarn has suggested the number 130, similar to the 150 elephants of Antiochus III, but he didn't explain how that number became 400. Scalard is also very skeptic. It is not easy to believe the figure of 480. But he also claims that we cannot be certain that Diodorus used Hieronymus direct. I think the slide is misplaced. Hang on. No. Okay. I either skipped. I think I skipped a slide. I'm sorry for this. But okay, I'll just quote Scalard in another passage. He claims that the attempt to assess the exact figure must be hazardous, if not arbitrary. And so he would not, he shares Tarn's skepticism, but believes that any attempt to try to assess the exact figure must it's only arbitrary. No clear solution can be suggested, but a feeling persists that 500 should be viewed with caution. Still, it would appear that the text might give us a clue. First, why 400 when Seleucus is known to have received 500? And I deeply apologize for the... No, okay. I missed a couple of slides, but okay, you followed my argument. The original story probably used the figure 100. And then while describing the division of elephants between the two wings, or the center and the wing of Seleucus, it used the word the rest, ta loipa. That's my suggestion. So a careless reader might have misinterpreted the rest as in the rest of the elephants out of 500, and thus reached the wrong number 400. This means that Plutarch and Diodorus did have a common source, but it was either an interpolated text or an epitome of another historian. That is, they did not use a historian, probably Hieronymus, directly. And this leads us to this slide. This is not far from what Scalard said. that the number of 480 in Diodorus is not derived from Hieronymus directly, since Diodorus is often contradicted in the numbers he gives. On the other hand, we can be certain that Diodorus used Hieronymus direct rather than through an intermediary, and the latter, of course, might have made the change. And again, Jane Hornblower in Hieronymus of Cardia, that Diodorus 480 has a specious precision, that there were similar exaggerations in the number of porous. Statistics show that the numbers are particularly liable to corruption and misunderstanding. Okay. I follow. I'm close to what scholars said about the Diodorus and Plutarch. Diodorus especially using a source which is not directly Hieronymus, but another source which either misunderstood him or corrected him, hypercorrected him, but with a minor change. The Diodorus himself adds a further confusion to the text, presumably by misreading and combining the number 400 in his text, which he found in an erroneous source, with another figure in the text, some 80 elephant, out of the approximately 100 used, which he placed at the wing or at the course. So Diodorus combined the two numbers to reach 480. If Seleucus had approximately 100 elephants, as I suggest, this is an impressive figure. It is one close to that of Eumenes previously, 114 in Gabiene, and maintaining a ratio that resembles the future Battle of Raphia. In Raphia, it's 102 to 73, so more or less what we have here. Thus, contrary to Scullard, it was not a force of elephants numerically vast in an excess of the 75 which Antigonus could deploy. It would be probably safe to assume that any number approaching 400 is fantastic and mythical. So if so, what really happened at the battlefield? Short answer, we don't know. But I can use reason and probability and comparison to other contemporary clashes to suggest the following scenario. We enter the world of speculation, but we proceed cautiously. Both sides were arrayed with infantry phalanx protected on the flanks by cavalry, as usual in this period. Demetrius probably repeated the same Antigone tactic of an oblique battle, whereby one wing of the enemy was to be driven off from the field, and then the enemy's center would be routed by the cavalry. For that purpose, Demetrius assembled on the Antigonid right wing the strongest unit of cavalry. On the opposite side, Antiochus headed a parallel strong cavalry force. Antigonus commanded the central phalanx. Demetrius and Antiochus were presumably protected by the river, as Ipsus lay the west bank of the old course of the river. The allies came from north facing south. Yes. Now, the fragment of Diodorus contains only a few words, but they are enough to indicate the real situation, if indeed the Byzantine excerpt is true to Diodorus' original description. First, the concentration on one front, perhaps at the expense of the other wing, matches the exact text of Diodorus at the Battle of Gaza, which neglects events at the center and left. This would lead us to conclude that the arrangement of Antigonus's army left no role to the other wing except defense. Second, it singles out Lysimachus. That's fragment 2. And this could mean several possibilities. One, that Lysimachus was positioned in the allied other wing, and perhaps some reconstruction placed him there in command of the cavalry in the allied right wing. But we are told that Lysimachus sent infantry to the battle rather than cavalry. Another option is that Lysimachus was in command of the entire allied phalanx, but this recent, reconstruction of Anson shows, but it is hard to believe that he would command the Asian levies and that Seleucus would be given solely a minor role of commanding the elephant contingent. Thus, the third option is that Lysimachus only commanded part of the infantry, presumably his own unit, which was directed by Seleucus's overall command. Therefore, when the Acceptor writes Lysimachus, this is certainly a mistake for the entire Seleucus-Lysimachus' line, as suggested by Gehr. And I refrain from translating it because the word Fluchtigkeit, I don't know how Altai would translate it, volatility, transience of the epitomator. So it was the epitomator's fault. Now, third, it follows that elephants were positioned either in front of the cavalry in the allied left, or indeed before the allied phalanx. This leaves us with three possible reconstructions. Either the same as in the Battle of Raphia, that is, elephants fronted the two wings of Antigonus's army and not the center, or as in the battles of Gaza and Gabiene, the elephants fronted one Antigonid wing of cavalry units, and the center was, but not the other wing, which was ordered to be on the defensive, or elephants fronted the center alone. Now, the order of the words in the Greek, that's in Diodorus fragment 2, might point out that the charge was that of Antigonus and that it was halted by Lysimachus. This is indeed in speculation, but if the order of the words has any relevance or any meaning. So both sides, as the fragment shows, the elephants were equal in courage and strength. So the charge could have been by the infantry or the cavalry on the other wing. The fact that the Acceptor was impressed by the clash of the elephants may have to do with the core of the image of the role of these animals in Ipsus. The elephants placed in front of Lysimachus, either at the wing or in the center, managed to block, like a wall, the charge opposite them. This is a minimal role, but much more realistic than the complicated maneuver assigned. Fifth, the focus on this clash of elephants implies that another part of Antigonus's army was not blocked. This either tallies with Plutarch's description that Demetrius's wing charged ahead, or it might imply a different portrayal in which there was some gap in the line of Antigonus. In the first stage, it would appear that there occurred a skirmish of light cavalry from Seleucus's left wing and Antigonus's right wing, where Demetrius was. This is exactly how the Battle of Gabiene began. In the second stage, Demetrius routed the allied left and started a pursuit of Seleucus's light cavalry and also of the heavy cavalry, headed by Antiochus in Seleucus's left wing. It does not appear sensible to suppose that Demetrius did so because of impetuous nature or uncontrollable temper of Demetrius. He may have tried to reach the baggage of Seleucus, exactly as Antigonus did successfully with Eumenes previously. This was also suggested by Bar Kokhba as well. Alternatively, and more likely, I think, Demetrius tried to save his own baggage to get back to Synada. You can see here, where Antigonus's royal treasury was located, and prevent Antiochus from reaching it. One need only remember how Demetrius fled to save the baggage in the Battle of Gaza. Demetrius thus presumably headed the pursuit was to the west and then to the east and south. Presumably Demetrius reached the place while Antiochus fled, so the pursuit came to nothing. Thus, if Antiochus's retreat was a trap set for Demetrius, as Tarn would have us believe, this succeeded even better than designed. Yet it is at this point, I think, that things went out of hand. As opposed to the clear and neat description of Plutarch, I do not believe that here disorder, I do believe that here disorder ensued, when the elephants of Antigonus himself, positioned in front of his own right wing and in front of Demetrius, also began charging forward. A similar happening occurred just a few years previously, as mentioned before. And similar to the havoc and fear instigated by the beasts, then it may have been the case that fear struck Demetrius' cavalry as well. In such a situation, with dust rising in all directions, Demetrius may not have been aware what was actually going on. Admittedly, we cannot find this in the texts we have. But if we are to assign any realistic role to elephants in this battle, as this front, I think, it is more realistic to believe that the elephants who would march in the direction of the pursuing Demetrius would be elephants positioned to march there in the first place. So if this is true, then this may be one source for the legend of the elephants describing the course of this particular battle. Thus, elephants were involved in Seleucus' victory, but the wrong elephants. Again, according to Plutarch, a neat description, Antigonus waited idly for Demetrius to return till he found himself surrounded by Seleucus. I also find this hard to believe. It would appear more likely that Antigonus acted quickly to prevent his center from being encircled, as much as Seleucus acted the same. Antigonus thus probably led a second charge of his center and left. It may be that Seleucus compensated for his loss of cavalry on his left wing by moving horse from his right wing. This was done by Eumenes previously, and no reason why it should not have happened here. This is perhaps how the allied cavalry managed to center and again to begin an encircling movement of Antigonus. The rest of the story now makes perfect sense. The allied phalanx continued to attack frontally. The allied harassed Antigonus' center without actually charging. This was intended to allow Antigonus' soldier to surrender and gradually move to the allied side. It may be that there was no gap in Antigonus' phalanx, but that it simply disintegrated. He himself fought to the very end till he was defeated and killed. Now, Billers claims, I think very realistically, it seems that Antigonus really was determined not to survive a defeat. But this could actually be said also of Demetrius. He did not return to assist his father because after his failed pursuit, we may conclude that Demetrius did not wish to return to a certain defeat. So in conclusion, several points must be said about the battle, the elephants, and the sources. The Battle of Ipsus is said to be the first occasion in which the Seleucids employed elephants in the army. It stands to reason that the employment of elephants in it, as found in later sources, was widely exaggerated. The clash was decided once Antigonus' soldiers switched sides. This is how Eumenes was defeated earlier. It would appear that both the number and the role of elephants in Ipsus were modest. This myth of the Seleukid army and the imaginative use of elephants correspond with Seleukid self-image and ideology. Scholars cannot understand how the greatest of all the Hellenistic elephant corps mysteriously disappeared from history. And again, later on, if the 500 elephants which Seleucus had in 301 were anywhere near that figure, then the force that his son Antiochus had at Apamea must have been considerably larger. However, an extraordinary situation develops. This massive force simply disappears from history. Since history, Antiochus had hastily to summon a mere 20 elephants from Babylon to help him against the Gauls, which brings us back to Altai's paper. But it may be the case that the elephant corps was never really that great. It was a great display of propaganda. Now, more importantly, let us turn to the sources very briefly. We said that Plutarch and Diodorus did have a common source, but it was either an interpolated text or epitome of another historian. We need to modify this slightly. The source used by Diodorus for the build-up and the background in Book 20 may not be the same that he used in Book 21. That's one point. It is not beyond Diodorus to change sources when beginning a new book. This is admittedly contrary to the old view that Diodorus kept relying on one text for several books. The source employed by Plutarch, and most likely not directly, may be Hieronymus of Cardia. who, according to the extremely dubious source Pseudo-Lucian, was an eyewitness at Ipsus, probably mistaken Ipsus and Gabbiene. But the source may have been Duris, as claimed by Bar Kokhba, and also I refer you to Sweet, the paper by Sweet. So basically, we don't know, again. But why did Plutarch accept the number of 400? We saw earlier the tongue-in-cheek description of the number of elephants in the biography of Alexander. Plutarch continues this train of thought in the Demetrius, which is all about unreal images and fame. Not every detail that Plutarch includes in his biographies is there because of its truthfulness. For instance, in the biography of Sulla, the Roman commander is described as capturing a satyr. This is reported in an authorial voice. And of course, it's not true. All these instances of fact and fiction, where fact and fiction are blurred in the lives, I have for years now claimed are part of a literary device Plutarch employs after Wayne Booth, called the unreliable narrator. Some point in the account, the reader's trust in the narrator breaks. And this leads to various outcomes, chief of which is understanding the text as being ironic. So it says one thing, but means another thing. The 400 elephants is a case in point. Now, the imagery of elephants serving this kind of an impenetrable structure was probably meant to harp on, sorry, I'm going backwards, to harp on a kind of description used of Demetrius. There's Demetrius' own reputation as a besieger of cities, rather the one who aimed to do so and did not always succeed, as in bronze. So here, ironically, he could not breach a wall of elephants. Here, Plutarch also uses the awkward and inflated number of elephants he found in his source to highlight Demetrius's vanity in failing to predict this amazing, unexpected real element in his pursuit of schemes and plans. This one motif recurrent in the life of Demetrius, the arbitrary and unpredictable element that always jeopardized Demetrius's intentions to act in accordance with his plans. Antigonus habitually pays attention to this element, and in chapter 28 even changes his customary practices after the mention of elephants. Plutarch also underscores the manner Demetrius and Antigonus, because of their individual love of glory, were not in concert with one another, but rather separately, and brought calamity on themselves. So these are just few examples of father-son rivalry in the biography, which is replete with them. This is also recurrent biography, a motif in the biography. For instance, in the siege in Athens, the father and son are struggling or fighting over a dead mouse to eat. So again, father-son rivalry. And in Ipsus itself, now there's a most glaring truth by the narrator. If Antigonus had made some trifling concessions and had slackened his excessive passion for dominion, he might have retained the supremacy for himself and have left it to his son. Now contrast this with, of course, with Seleucus, who obviously wants to keep Antiochus and gives up his a very precious thing to his son in the biography. So this contrast of father-son working together against father and son, fighting for glory against each other. And another point in the positioning of the detail of the elephants in the chapter draws a somewhat impenetrable line between Antigonus's unusual arrogance in the first half of the chapter, for instance here, I will not read it, and his modified behavior in the latter part, after the mention of the 400 elephants. Here he is modest, you see at the end he's silent, and he's pronouncing his son as a successor. So, and the elephants are basically like an allegory of the elephant, like a line between the two behaviors of Antigonus. Now, all of this has to do with images. Now, in the Battle of Ipsus, Antigonus was conversing in the tent with his son, and the word is skene. But once we recall that skene is basically a stage, and the narrator claims that the story is either comic or tragic, and the stage is there. So everything we gather that everything is really basically imagery, and not real. And finally, Plutarch presents Seleucus as a great domesticator of beasts, as Demetrius mocked him. Here he mocked Seleucus as a master of elephants shortly before he himself is blocked by elephants to assist his own father. So the joke was on Demetrius himself. And in the final chapters of the biography, Seleucus not only domesticates elephants, but domesticates Demetrius himself, who is a prisoner and stays in Seleucus's court in a cage. So these artistic touches, combining many threads and themes in the biography, in the depiction of the battle, make it truly into one of the most interesting pictures of a battle in literature, although for historians it leaves much to be desired. But it is a great portrayal at the hand of a great artist and befitting a great battle of which we still don't know much. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for your elephantastic presentation, Eran. That was extremely rich. But instead of attempting a feedback myself now, I'm very glad that Angus Jacobson accepted my invitation to be the expert today. Angus is a PhD student at the University of Tasmania, and his field is the early Antigonid-Seleukid relations. He works under the supervision of Charlotte Dunn, whom you, Eran, have already mentioned as the co-author of the important book on Demetrius. Angus has many aspects and qualities that recommend him for this presentation. I only mention on the side that he is also an artist, which he has shown to us in Utrecht, where he presented his painting of Seleucus I and also wrapped this into a creative context, something that has been published in the creative journal Epic Threads. But in Utrecht, he also gave an elephantastic talk himself, which clearly makes him the great expert to listen to now. Angus, the floor is yours.
Right, I'm just going to share my screen quickly. Okay, how does that look? Good? Excellent. Well, thank you very much for your kind introduction, Altai, and thank you to you and Ben for having me at long last. I think it's
Sorry for interrupting. Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah.
I see that you're not sharing your screen fully. At least
at
now? My end, it's cut. I'm not sure if it's
No, it's full.
It's full at your end. Okay, then the recording will be good, and I will.
Okay, great, excellent. Yeah, I think it's been about a year and a half since I last presented for the lecture series, so it's nice to return. Thank you for having me back, and to also engage with such an excellent paper. I'm pleased that somehow I have gained the title of becoming the group's Elephant Man, though I now fear that such a title may be contested after this fantastic paper that Eran has just delivered. When Eran first approached me about the matter of elephants at Ipsus during the 8th Seleukid study day at Utrecht, I was naturally concerned. Though, as Eran has shown, some scholars have gingerly expressed doubts surrounding the battle's proceedings, debate concerning the Battle of Ipsus appeared long settled, and there was, for the most part, scholarly consensus that a battle took place between the anti-Antigonid coalition and the Antigonid army, wherein Seleucus's elephants, whether 400 or 480 in number, won the day. For example, Wheatley and Dunn, who has already been mentioned. But our friend here has developed a habit of forcing us to question our scholarly preconceptions, which is something that I wholeheartedly welcome. So I've really tried to approach this paper today with an open mind, thinking about ways that we can actually strengthen Eran's argument. In general, Eran, I find your argument well executed and intuitive, if not a little Teutonian at times. And given the source deficiency that plagues the matter, it is no easy thing to either support your argument or categorically disprove it. For that matter, with what little time I have, I would like to address the major points, particularly regarding the number of elephants and their practicality, the practicality of their use at Ipsus. Now, the element of your argument that I find most convincing is that against the presence of all 500 elephants on the battlefield. The practicality of employing 500 elephants, let alone 400 beasts, near such a narrow pass is ultimately dubious, even if we do accept that Seleucus did divide his elephants between the rear and the vanguards, and possibly also the wings, which is a concept that an idea that I also agree with, but of course we have no evidence for it, or very little evidence for it. Strabo's reference to Seleucus maintaining his herd at Apamea, in fact, may betray that not all elephants were present, and that on his return to the west, Seleucus halted in Apamea and organized the offloading of some beasts to speed up his westward march. In this way, Apamea may have indeed been home to all 500 elephants or at least for a very short time, lending some credence to Strabo's statement. That said, your argument does rely on the lack of precedent for both the number and use of Seleucus's elephants, which constitutes, as you yourself highlight, argumentum excellentio. Some nuance is perhaps needed here. Namely, when employing Porus's 200 elephants, or 85 if Curtius Rufus is preferred, and Antiochus III's 150, which is partially made up of Sophocles' forcefully acquired elephants, to cast doubt on Seleucus's ownership of 500 elephants, which is in essence channeling Tarn's argument, we must not disregard the fact that Porus and Sophocles' royal power, and thus their capacity to furnish such a large force, is incomparable to that of Chandragupta. Both Porus and Sophocles, it should be noted, were regional kings. Justin is probably most accurate in treating Porus as unus ex regibus Indorum, that is, one of the kings from India, not the king of India, whereas Chandragupta had achieved imperial power through which he could centralize the major elephant forests, these places where the elephants were protected and raised for military and state uses, these hastivana as they're called. And this would in turn grant him access to substantially more elephants than Porus and Sophocles. In fact, there is about, I think, 8 royal, or as I think actually it's said here in Cosman's note, that there are around 8 royal elephant forests in the Indian region. So I'll read Cosman's note quickly. This is just referring to the number here. So he notes that although the immense size of the elephant force has raised doubts, notably Tarn 1940, whose arguments have been dismissed by Troutman 1982 and lots of his subsequent publications as well, it is by no means impossible. If Megasthenes is to be believed, all elephants had passed into royal ownership since Alexander's invasion. Cortelias Arthashastra, an Indian handbook of good governance dating back in part to the Mauryan kingdom, contains a canonical list of 8 royal elephant forests. Troutman 1982 points to medieval parallels. Mahmud of Ghazni had 1,300 elephants in his muster of 1023 CE. His son Masud, almost 400 more less than a decade later. In 1311 CE, the eunuch general Malik Kafur brought more than 600 to Delhi as spoils of his southern expedition. On Indian herds more broadly, Megasthenes, which is preserved through Diodorus, Book 2, Chapter 37, Subchapter 3, claims that the Gandharidae had 4,000 elephants alone. To Chandragupta, Plutarch and Pliny ascribe an unbelievable, emphasis probably on the unbelievable, 9,000 elephants. We do not, in fact, know what source Plutarch and Pliny are using here, but obviously they are using the same source. It's likely not Megasthenes, because Megasthenes gives much more modest numbers for Chandragupta's army, but does not actually give a number of elephants. Pliny recalls, in addition, the Indian king's possession of other large herds, close in number or greater than Seleucus's herd. For instance, we hear that an active army of 700 elephants is ascribed to the Gangarid Kalingai, 4,000 to the Thalutai, 1,000 to the Andarai, 500 to the Magalai, 300 to the Asmagi, 1,600 to the Arabastrai, and 500 to the Pandai, who I should note, this is when Eran mentions this mythical king giving elephants to Heracles. It's actually the other way around. Heracles is giving elephants to a mythical king, and she's not a king at all. She's a queen, who is Pandai, the daughter, wife of Heracles. And it should be noted that this is actually perhaps more likely influenced by the Indus Treaty and the giving of 500 elephants, and not vice versa. So in general, there is precedent in the Indian world, which is quite interesting. But of course, these numbers may also be exaggerated. But it's also important to look to those Indian sources for that additional precedent. And precedent, I would argue, is important to understanding the coalition strategy at Ipsus, including the use of elephants. The battle strategy which you propose, Eran, is, as you yourself probably rightly note, somewhat speculative. But of course, we have to be somewhat speculative when we're dealing with this. I'm personally hesitant to disregard the battle narrative which Plutarch and Diodorus form, as I'm sure many others are as well. My interpretation of the battle has always been that Seleucus was consciously employing the tactics which the Antigonids themselves, or their enemies as well, had historically used in battles as a means of lulling his enemies into a false sense of familiarity. When they were all too confident in their victory, Seleucus ripped that security away by executing the unthinkable. I said as much in my first, the first chapter draft, which I wrote for my Elephantine Legacy for the reception volume. And I'll read a little bit now because I've actually removed this from the chapter, so it'll never see the light of day. So I'm giving you some insight into how I was thinking about the Ipsus at the time I wrote this. So I wrote, as many have suggested, Seleucus's careful positioning and swift deployment of so many elephants indicates his strategy was premeditated. We need only compare the battle plans of Demetrius at Gaza and those of Seleucus at Ipsus to realize that Nicator, in expecting Demetrius's reliance on prior experience with coalition tactics at Gaza, had predicted and countered his opponent's every move. By positioning the young and ostensibly inexperienced Antiochus in command of the left-wing cavalry, Seleucus must have hoped to evoke Demetrius's own position as left-wing cavalry commander at Gaza. Recognizing the tactics and presuming his opponent's reckless youth, Demetrius took the bait and adopted the tactics used against himself at Gaza. When he was all but victorious, he surely considered Ptolemy and Seleucus's failure in allowing his own cavalry to leave unpursued, and so resolved to crush the Seleukid cavalry. Here, Seleucus diverts from feigning the use of Antigonid tactics and brilliantly deploys an offensive elephant rearguard. Such a use of war beasts was unprecedented in post-Alexander warfare, as they were generally positioned offensively in the advance guard to crush and terrify oncoming troops. Though some commanders such as Monophthalmos and Eumenes tended to employ these beasts defensively in the wings and flanks, Nicator's recent interactions with India might have inspired the coalition's strategy, particularly relating to pachyderms. I then go on to talk about the four wings of the army and how this might be, with reference to the Arthashastra, which is this political military treatise, which spans evidence from the 3rd century BCE to the 3rd century CE. And that he might be here using actually Indian tactics in the Battle of Ipsus for this elephant maneuver. But of course, once again, we could argue about these things really all day. But in this case, Antigonus and Demetrius could not have anticipated Seleucus's maneuver because they anticipated another movement, or simply because they could not anticipate it because the move was unprecedented. How would they know that this would have actually been attempted? I touched briefly on your points regarding topography because I personally find it a problematic line of reasoning. The sources are, of course, not clear about exactly where Ipsus is to be located, nor do they provide any certainty concerning the terrain. We know not whether the battle took place, as you say, nearby a junction in the river Caistras and a tributary stream, and the valley of Dole Chai is an incredibly large parcel of land, as we can see here. In fact, I have a larger photo later on. With plenty of areas with high elevation, which would enable a successful employment of a massive elephantine wool, or semi-successful at least. Not to mention, we are about 2 millennia removed from the event, and as we all know, rivers rise and fall, and so apparently do mountains. So the land can change quite a lot in 2,000 years. Even if we accept the location of Sipson, the valley entrance to its north provides a likely and plausible location around 5 kilometers wide where Seleucus could employ his maneuver, or at least with enough room to employ the maneuver. Demetrius in this area would chase the fleeing calf out through the smaller valley, and by the time he turned around, he would not only have mountains or small hills in his path, but elephants, dust, and disorder, building on Eran's description there. Admittedly, we could argue about these logistical and topographical aspects of the battle with very few definitive conclusions. Now, Eran also mentioned before that I had done the calculations for what would be required to actually successfully shield this path here. It doesn't look good for all of us in favor of trying to argue against Eran's argument. So you would need approximately 1,246 elephants to block this pass of around 5 kilometers. And this is taking into account that these elephants are given double their size in room to actually maneuver properly. So this is drawing on the Arthashastra, which mentions that typically elephants were trained to be enclosed into areas of double their size. So an elephant is around 1.9 at most. The Elephas maximus, so Indian elephants, we should remember that we are talking about Indian elephants here, are around 1.9 meters in width. So you double that, 3.8. meters in width, and the actual pass is around 4.7 kilometers. So you end up needing around 1,246 to block the whole path. So it's a lot of elephants, and you can't really sort of space 100 or so elephants out over that time. But here is a little a new updated battle thing that I've just had, so we can visualize it. It's not really important to my argument, but it was fun to make. So you can see here that if we follow the traditional reconstruction, the horses would go up through that valley there, which is surrounded by the mountains. Demetrius's horses would follow, the elephants would go across, and then you would probably need also an elephant wing there as well to move across and block the center, so it wouldn't be susceptible to being crushed by Demetrius's returning cavalry. And there is the general valley of Dolai in general, and then Sonata down there as well. There is a great deal more I could say in response to your paper, Eran. I am intrigued in general, or in particular, by your treatment of Plutarch and Hieronymus and their reasoning for exaggerating the narrative. Altai and I have been steadily working away on an article which demonstrates that Plutarch was very much in control of his characterization of Seleucus, which is not always a particularly positive one in the Demetrius. Your comment on Antigonus and Demetrius not succeeding because of their ultimate inability to act in concert is insightful and acts as a nice counterpoint to Plutarch's description of the Antagonids' exceptional familial piety. In fact, he's quite showing the opposite, that they were always in contest with one another. But unfortunately, my time does run short, and I want to have some questions I want to see the other people's questions as well. So I will, in any case, provide you with further comments in the future if you do pursue a publication. Truthfully, I do not find myself fully convinced by a revision, though I find myself scarily more convinced after hearing your updated paper. But I do find convincing, obviously, the need for revision, however difficult that may be. As your paper has capably demonstrated, the sources are not in agreement, and there are several awkward discrepancies between them. The loss of Diodorus' full account of the matter is particularly regrettable in approaching this topic. It seems the only solution is to look to the wider context to piece together an acceptable reconstruction of the event, as you have done. These contexts, however, should not solely be martial nor Greco-Macedonian, nor should we only consider literary evidence. I finish by noting that the sheer prominence of elephantine iconography on Seleukid coins in Ipsus's aftermath, in fact, provides the clearest indication that the elephant's role at Ipsus was far more than just modest, or at least that Seleucus intended to cast it that way. And I include here the famous bronzes from Apamea with the elephant and the horned horse, possibly referring to the role of the elephant corps and the cavalry in the Battle of Ipsus. So thank you once again, Eran, and thank you all for your attention.
Wow, thank you, Angus. That was a very rich response. Well, that was a little paper in itself, and I now feel actually bad that we do not have many hours more to get into more details. But I think it's now Eran who would like to have the opportunity to respond first. Okay. So I'm not yet opening the floor, but Byron, I see that you are trying to contribute, and you will have your chance. We'll go a little over time today to make sure that everyone has a chance to be part of this discussion. But Eran, now you please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Angus, for a great response. I appreciate your argument and suggestions, and I think there is room for certain agreements between us. At least we can agree to disagree. I will address your main points quickly. We don't have much time, so I have 10 points to make. One, as I mentioned in my paper, there are more questions than answers, and I do not pretend to know all the answers. I just posed a few questions and queries along the lines of previous scholarship. In general, I sense that we both agree that there is a sudden unease about Plutarch's description of the Battle of Ipsus, both the number of elephants and their use. A revision is needed. I don't think the debate has ever been settled, contrary to what you said. Point number 2, the first part of my paper basically addresses 2 difficulties: the number of the elephants and their use in the battle. But one argument does not depend on the other. That's unlike Tarn. So we might imagine that Seleucus did receive 500 elephants, as fanciful as it might seem. But that does not mean that most of them or all of them were used in the battle or in this particular way. Certainly not 400. 3, we might also accept that elephants were somehow important to the victory of the coalition of Seleucus, as I've tried to show, but that does not necessitate assuming that 400 of them were used in the maneuver. These, again, are 2 different arguments. Now, I agree about the elephant's dust and disorder bit in your response. The problem we have with all these neat descriptions of battles is that they are done with hindsight, because during the clash itself, no one was really sure what was going on, except for some few gifted commanders. All we have are depictions which are simplified and then recycled and distorted over the years. We do not have a narrative neither by Diodorus, disappeared, but we do not have a narrative of Plutarch. We do not actually have a narrative of the battle. So that's that. Point number 5. Now, speculation is not something we should shy away from as historians, but speculation has to be reasonable. Employing 400 elephants in a sophisticated maneuver mid-battle, starting from position in the rear guard behind the troops, is not reasonable and borders on fantasy. It disregards almost all the evidence we have of how dangerous these beasts were during battle and how they were actually used. 6, it is no accident that this fantastic maneuver was unprecedented and was never imitated, as far as I know. I'm willing to reconsider my position if there are other examples, which we should study carefully, but as far as I know, there is no parallel to this. 7, I did take the time to look at the late Indian source you mentioned in English translation and found no parallel to it in the maneuver. So unless I'm wrong, I found no parallel. 8, my point about the topography is not that the valley did not provide a plausible location for the maneuver, but that this maneuver was needless, if indeed it meant to block Demetrius from returning to the field. Demetrius could easily have circumvented the elephants by passing through the tributary stream or elsewhere. 9. Now, that's the point about the sources. Hieronymus of Cardia. It is problematic to assume anything about a source that is completely lost. But to propose some answer to your question, Angus, I do not think that he included the figure of 400 elephants. So that's my answer. Plutarch and Diodorus read an interim source which had this figure based on an erroneous reading of Hieronymus or whoever that was. So Diodorus uncritically repeated it and embellished it in a Diodoran fashion, and Plutarch noticed that it is unbelievable, but chose to use it nevertheless for his own purposes. You say that you write on Plutarch, that Plutarch's Lives is one of the greatest literary works of art in Greek literature, works so sophisticated that they overshadow many other Greek texts. Plutarch narratives cannot be taken at face value. There are reasons for Plutarch distorting his sources, which are literary and moralistic. Overall, they aim to paint a picture of the character or the protagonist. So it is not beyond Plutarch to give his narrator some dubious details, as I mentioned, the unreliable narrator. Don't forget that. Now, that's my last point, the 10th point, is a note about the elephantine iconography of the Seleukid coins that you mentioned. That I will address it without committing to any single explanation. First, we should also note the Ptolemaic elephantine iconography here for a broader context. There's a series of the portrait of the deified Alexander the Great wearing an elephant scalp on his head. That's silver between 312 and 305. The second series is a reverse showing a deified Alexander holding a thunderbolt and scepter, standing on a chariot drawn by 4 elephants. That a gold stater from between 305 and 298. Both series attempt to show continuity between Alexander and Ptolemy. I would guess this is also part of Seleucus's depiction of elephants. Second, elephants would imply the strength of the empire, with subtle imperial claims beyond the actual reach of the Seleukid power. In other words, the elephantine iconography on the Seleukid coins might play a role with regard to the east, that the Apollo on the Omphalos in Delphi played for the imaginary claims with regard to the west. The Seleucids did not control Delphi or India, but they promoted images that would present them as making some sort of an imperial claim beyond their reach, with political, religious, and cultural implications. Third, the fact that elephants were elevated to an imperial iconography on coins does not mean that 400 elephants were used in Ipsus. So it's completely beside the point. So the bottom line is we simply do not know what happened, but we can only try to guess.
Thank you so much. And this time, I think I will need a little bit more time to sort my own thoughts about these many arguments going into different directions. And I'm glad that I think Byron is going to ask the first question or make the first comment.
Hi, thank you for that fantastic, fascinating talk and great response. I enjoyed both of them a lot. I guess I was thinking as I was listening, to propose a defense of the rearguard idea, it need not be a tactical trick, I suppose, because you can have, theoretically, you could have a bunch of elephants if you have a lot of elephants, not necessarily 480, but if you have a lot of them, you could have a bunch in the rear that would be able to do ad hoc responses. And the thing is, we know that Pyrrhus was at this battle, and we know that Pyrrhus used elephant reserves, because at Heraclea, he holds them back, then he brings them in. At Asculum, he sends a bunch of them to the camp when the camp is attacked by the Daunians, which suggests that he does actually, even with only 20 or so elephants, he's able to make effective use of an elephant reserve. And if he got that idea from Ipsus, that would sort of, I mean, that's just a possibility there. And we know that the Sasanians did it as well. Shapur II uses elephant reserves. Well, the commandant in Ctesiphon has an elephant reserve at the Battle of Ctesiphon. It reappears again at the Battle of Maranga, I think it's called. And yeah, I suppose I just think if we think of it more like Asculum rather than this grand tactical plan, a possibility is that Demetrius is able to push ahead, but the response of the person in charge of the elephants in the rear is to charge to the danger spot because the camp's in trouble, much like what happens at Asculum. And in the chaos of pursuing Antiochus, they get confronted by the elephants. And at that point, it doesn't really matter whether they're blocking the return to the battlefield. At that point, panic's going to ensue anyway when you have an elephant reserve charging down upon you. So that's just a thought that I was having. And I guess I was just struck that I do think elephants are sometimes more versatile and more than I think we sometimes realize that Southeast Asian, Indian, Persian cultures kept using them for centuries and centuries and centuries. And so I think that I do think that sort of strengthens Scullard's case that we're dealing with a trope a bit sometimes with this stuff when thinking about how risky they are when they are intelligent animals. But anyway, those are just some thoughts. If either of you want to respond to that, yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for mentioning Pyrrhus. Pyrrhus, of course, was with Demetrius pursuing the flying Seleucus and his cavalry, but ironically, Pyrrhus himself was blocked by elephants. If we follow this narrative, another anecdote, another detail here, that in the life of Pyrrhus, when he mentions the Battle of Ipsus, he doesn't mention elephants at all. Just another point here. But you're right about the reserve. But well, as you mentioned, the maneuver was not. This maneuver was never tried. So the reserve was there. And as you were right to perceive that it was very, very risky. So keeping the elephants in reserve behind the troops, no matter, you have to have a distance of some sort. But it was very risky indeed, and it very suits Pyrrhus and his character. But yeah, of course. So basically, I agree with your examples and the mention of Pyrrhus. Yeah, but and other points that you mentioned, I think there was the last point. Again, we don't find any parallel for this maneuver. So again, I don't think they could be used to argue for this narrative to in sort of to justify this narrative or in some way. Okay. So
I think sorry, Altai. I saw you were about to go. Then I think I'll just add that with the thing about Eran's argument, which I think is really quite good, is that he doesn't write elephants out completely. That elephants remain an integral part of the battle, just in a different way. So I think Byron, when you mentioned that. Elephants, of course, they have to be useful in battle because they continue to hold an important part in Indian and Persian militaries. I don't think really. I think that Eran is actually arguing that anyway, that they were still important to the battle, just in a different way. So my response here is actually supporting Eran there, just a little bit.
Okay, Graham, please.
Yep. Okay. I don't know if my video will work, but thanks, Eran. Very interesting. I'm not sure I agree, but anyway, we'll worry about that later. But I've written elsewhere, as you guys probably know, that elephants in front of the battle line, I don't think were there all the time anyway, and most of the elephants were on the flanks as screens. So I always interpreted, and I wrote this before at Ipsus, that actually the elephants that Seleucus has aren't necessarily behind the army waiting for this maneuver to happen, but they are part of one of the wing's elephant screens, probably the left wing, so that they could have been in depth. So Eumenes, the highest that I found of elephant screens on the wings is 75 that Eumenes uses. So that's not that dissimilar. If they're all in a line next to each other, you put 4 in a line, so 4 lines of elephants, you get close to 400 already in a deep elephant screen. So then the cavalry charge that happens at Ipsus is very similar to the cavalry charge that happens at Gabiini, at Pereitikini, at Raphia, where the cavalry attacks the cavalry around the side of the elephant screen. And so then Demetrius's cavalry attack forces Antiochus's cavalry back. They're already to the side of the elephants. So then they get chased off. And then Seleucus deploys the elephant screen to screen behind, as well as where it was originally stationed next to the phalanx. So it's not necessarily moving a whole bunch of elephants from behind the army, but simply redeploying the flank elephant screen slightly further. And that then will allow them to be closer without this pre-planned maneuver necessarily. It's just a redeployment of a screen that already exists. But I'm not convinced that the number 400 should be thrown out with the bathwater, considering the nickname, the Elephant General, has to have come from being given a lot of elephants. Otherwise, it makes no sense. And 120 is not a lot. So the nickname only comes from selling massive portions of land for a lot of elephants. And they disappear later because they die. Elephants in captivity only last 20 to 30 years. So they won't have lasted much longer past Ipsus anyway. So to me, the ironical nicknames that all 4 rulers get, Demetrius is a besieger because he's terrible at sieges, and Ptolemy is an admiral because he's terrible at naval battle. Lysimachus, and then you have Demetrius, Seleucus, because he sold massive tracts of land for elephants that didn't survive long enough to make it warrant the sale. So to me, the 500 elephants make sense. And if you have that many elephants, which you purposely wanted when you sold it, and you're fighting an existential battle to stop Antigonus, why would you not bring all your elephants with you? What's the point of having them in your sale of India if you're not going to use them against your main rival? So I don't necessarily follow your arguments for why they weren't 400. And I'm not entirely convinced that you've argued why they can't have been deployed out from where they were in the battle to prevent Demetrius coming back. Anyway, sorry, I could go on for a long time, but I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. I agree with some of the things you mentioned, and in some respects you went even further than what I intended, like the ironic names that you mentioned. So yes, I agree. I agree about the with what you said about the elephant being kept in one of the wings. If you recall, this was one of the options I proposed. I don't quite follow you about the screen behind, because they have to screen something, and if there's nothing behind them, I'm not really sure I got your point about that. But the maneuver is basically deploying the elephants to block and not to screen. So I don't quite follow the argument you presented there. Well, the name Elephant Commander, well, you contradicted yourself, because if the names are ironic, also the Elephant Commander could be an ironic name as well, if no elephants were actually elephants were used. But one of the arguments you mentioned, you asked what's the main argument not to use 400 elephants in the battle? Well, because it is very risky. And I think if you follow all the accounts, and regardless of what you think about what Troutman recently said about there's the Roman trope of skepticism, elephant skepticism. But if you follow the accounts themselves, elephants are very unpredictable. They're risky, they're unreliable, and they stampede on their own men, and they cause panic in the lines and in the army of the Rome. So this is basically the reason why they should not have been kept behind, and any sane commander would not do that, or would not take the risk. That's the basic idea of what I said. If we follow all of the evidence we have, I think this is the solitary evidence we have of this of using elephants in this manner, because all the other sources we have betray the sense of skepticism and the reluctance to use them, and a very so it is very, very different in that respect.
Yeah, okay. So the ironic nickname I was saying, well, Haeckel's argued this before, but that the other kings find it amusing that Seleucus gives up half his territory for only 500 elephants that die. So not that he didn't get them, that the nickname doesn't come because he didn't get them, but because he did get them, and it's a foolish thing to do. But you're right, he might not have used them in the battle as the ironic nickname, but I think the difference becomes between screen and block. The way I'm using the term screen is that elephant screens on the flanks, which we know happened repeatedly, are there to use space, protecting the infantry on the right-hand side or on the one side and the cavalry on the other side. So they are blocking space as a screen already. So that tactic is not new. It's just that the elephant screen has moved from blocking a frontal attack to screening or shielding, or whatever word you want to use, a rear attack. So it's just redeploying the screen to prevent enemy coming from a different direction, which is similar to what Eumenes was probably trying to do at Gabiini when Antigonus rides all the way around, but the dust prevents him doing so, right? That is the closest to Ipsus already. It's basically the same, except the angles of the elephant placement and the number of the elephants is different, is how I see it.
Okay. Can we leave with that? Okay.
So our time is coming to an end slowly, but steadily, unfortunately. And I do not actually feel in the best position to even aim at a conclusion, because there are so many details that I will still have to think about. And what is very sure is that you, Eran, and Angus have opened up many new discussions and conversations. I would say, however, that after hearing this altercation of arguments, I'm siding a little bit with Eran when it comes to the 500, because the strongest counter argument that Angus offered was focusing on figures from India and in India, and did not actually address all the logistic and practical concerns that Eran has offered, and add to this the observation that the number, whether 480, 500, is just so close to the total number from the Chandragupta agreement. All of that together seems to me to indicate that we, or at least for me personally, that I'm right now following Eran in assuming that the numbers were smaller. I feel a little lost when it comes to the possible tactical deployments, because there were so many options that you have discussed, and I would say that this discussion has to go on. But Eran's paper would not be fully appreciated if we not also focus a little bit more on his literary arguments. I think they were also very rich, even though they were presented very late in the presentation, because he first tried to account for all the content-related aspects. But understanding the artistry of Plutarch better, and seeing that relation with between Seleucus as the master of the elephants, how that resonates with the battle description, that of course seems very obvious to me. I'm not yet sure, and that discussion will certainly also continue, how freely Plutarch would reshape the evidence or the traditions that he was drawing on. I do think, and that is what you clearly emphasized, he was drawing on a lot of diverse sources, so he could actually choose. I would be very hesitant to present him as someone who fabricated, but as he had so much choice, by freely drawing on the choices he had and reconfiguring the evidence, he could then take a very active role in shaping the description of Seleucus and Demetrius. I need to think more about your argument as to whether the elephants had an allegorical meaning for the description of Demetrius, and of course the book, the biography was on Demetrius and not Seleucus. So I withhold judgment here, but promise to keep thinking about this, because this will be important for our project, Angus's and my project, of understanding better how Plutarch is presenting Seleucus. So that is a relevant pathway of further thinking. But I am surprised how little attention a possible Antigonid or pro-Antigonid perspective has been given to the account, because that was always for me the obvious reading, not so much considering the feasibility, and I perhaps was a little bit too credulous, but the account as we have it is so defensive or apologetic for Demetrius, who failed to protect his father, and basically was the main cause for the disaster for the Antigonid side. So that is something I would also like to be seen discussed a little further. And the pro-Seleukid side, or the immediate response to the Seleukid elephantine propaganda, need not be in contradiction to the pro, or let's say apologetic presentation of Demetrius. So that is still something I think that needs to be teased out in the further discussion. But I think we should close our official meeting now. I'm sure the discussion will go on in this meeting, and then also throughout our next encounters. But please let me end by thanking Eran and Angus for a highly stimulating presentation, and also by announcing our next speaker, Talia Prusin, has been with us. I'm not sure if she's still in the meet. Yes, she still is. So Talia will join us next month once again from Cornell University, and she will present. I've tried to write down the title so that I don't mess it up, but I don't find it right now. It will be on the kleroi and the Seleukid use of the klerokia, and the respondent will be John Serrati. So I thank all of you for joining us again, staying with us patiently throughout this discussion, contributing, and well, I look forward to seeing you soon again.
Thank you.